The goats were on the roof. Not all 37 of them, but a good half-dozen, their neat black hooves finding purchase on the weathered shingles of the forgotten house. They stood silhouetted against a sky the color of a fading bruise, munching placidly on the last tenacious vines of kudzu, as if they were grazing in a meadow tilted toward heaven. Down in the town of Harmony Creek, this was considered the final proof of Elspeth Mayhew's madness. To buy the kudzu heap for back taxes was one thing, a fool's errand, but understandable in a woman alone, new to the territory and clearly touched by some distant grief. To then acquire a herd of raggedy goats and fence in that suffocating green mess was another level of strangeness altogether. But to have those same goats, months later, reveal a whole house that had been swallowed by the vine, and then to let them climb upon its very roof, that was an act of profound and pitiable insanity.
They said she was not just living with animals, but had begun to think like one. They said the sun had cooked her wits. They said it was a shame, a young woman with no people to guide her. They watched from the road, shaking their heads, their judgment as solid and unyielding as the baked summer earth. What they did not yet know was that the roof beneath the goats' feet was sound, its timbers solid oak, and that inside the house, in the cool of the stone-lined cellar, Elspeth Mayhew was counting. She was doing the arithmetic of survival, and for the first time in a very long time, the numbers were beginning to sing a song of hope. The goats on the roof were not a sign of madness. They were a declaration of victory. 2 springs earlier, Elspeth had arrived with one small trunk and a silence that seemed to cling to her like road dust. She did not speak of where she had come from, only that she was looking for a piece of land to own for herself.
In the land agent's office, Silas Croft had shown her the proper parcels, the neat squares of prairie pasture or bottomland with creek access, all priced for men with families and futures. He had a salesman's smooth sympathy, his voice oozing a condescension keyed precisely to what he saw. A woman alone, with a small purse and a large, unfocused sorrow in her eyes. She listened politely, her gaze distant. When he was done, she asked about the parcel no one ever asked about. Lot 78, the kudzu heap. Croft had laughed, a dry little puff of air. Child, that's not land. It's a problem. 70 acres of it. They say a man named Abernathy built a place in there 30 years ago, and the vine just ate it. Ate his fences, his barn, and finally his will to live. It's worthless. You'd do better to sleep in the street. But Elspeth had seen it from the wagon road, a rolling hill cloaked in a single, monstrous green blanket. A place so thoroughly conquered by one thing that it seemed to have a presence, a personality. It was a place as consumed by its past as she was by hers. "I'll take it," she'd said, her voice quiet but firm. The price was little more than the owed taxes. Croft sold it to her with the weary air of a man selling a bottle of poison to a suicide, taking her money with a small, pitying shake of his head. The town's verdict was swift and merciless. She was a fool. A poor, lonely fool who had bought herself a grave and would spend the rest of her short, miserable time in Harmony Creek trying to dig her way out. Elspeth walked the boundary of her new property the next day. The word walk was not quite right. It was a struggle, a battle. The kudzu was not merely a plant. It was an architecture of smothering. Its vines, thick as a man's wrist, twisted into dense, python-like ropes that coiled over everything. Its broad leaves formed a canopy so thick that the ground beneath was in a perpetual, humid twilight. She could not see the lay of the land, could not find a single landmark beyond the occasional skeleton of a long dead tree, its branches draped in green like a forgotten corpse. She pushed through a wall of leaves and felt the ground give way, tumbling into a hidden depression, the air knocked from her lungs. Lying there, staring up at the suffocating ceiling of green, the town's judgment echoed in her ears. Fool. For a long moment, she felt the weight of it, the sheer impossibility of the task. It was a living ocean, and she had no boat. She had traded her small inheritance, the last tangible piece of her past life, for a vertical swamp. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced the humid air. She was one person, alone. She was about to climb out, to walk away and never look back, when a voice drifted through the leaves. "You find the bottom of it, little miss?" An old man stood at the edge of the property line, leaning on a fence post that marked the beginning of his own neat, sensible pasture. He had a long, white beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. This was Mr. Johansson, her nearest neighbor. He did not mock. His gaze was steady, curious. Elspeth brushed herself off, her face hot with shame. "I think I might have," she admitted. He nodded slowly, stroking his beard. He looked at the wall of green not as an enemy, but as a puzzle. "My father, back in the old country," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "He would say, 'You do not fight the flood with a bucket. You find where the river wants to go.' This," he waved a gnarled hand at the kudzu, "this is a flood, a green one." He squinted. "But every trouble has a tool made just for it. The right tool for the right trouble, little miss. And patience. God does not hurry, but he is never late." That afternoon, he brought over a thermos of chicory coffee and 2 tin cups. They sat on a fallen log at the edge of her property, staring into the green maw. He asked her no personal questions, did not pry into the sorrow that shadowed her eyes. He spoke only of the land. "That vine," he said, "it is hungry, always hungry. So you must find something hungrier." He told her about goats, not the fine, fat dairy goats that gave quarts of sweet milk, but the tough, scrawny, brush-eating kind, the ones with fire in their bellies and no sense in their heads. The kind of animal that saw a wall of thorns and saw a feast. "They will eat it down to the dirt," he promised. "They will climb to get the last leaf. They will turn this poison into milk and meat. But first, a fence. A goat fence must be horse-high, pig-tight, and bull-strong. They are lawyers, goats. They will study the law of the fence until they find a loophole." A plan began to form in Elspeth's mind, a small, fragile thing, but the first real plan she'd had in years. It was practical, it was methodical, it did not require her to face the entire 70 acres at once, only to build a fence, one post hole at a time. That night she did the arithmetic, the cost of wire, the cost of posts, the cost of the goats themselves. She laid out her remaining money on the small table in her rented room in town. It was not enough, but it was close. Close enough to try. The next morning, she went to the livery to sell the one thing of value she had left from her old life, a small gold locket with a faded engraving. The man gave her less than it was worth, but it was enough. The decision felt like cutting the last rope to a sinking ship. She was no longer a woman with a past. She was a woman with a fence to build. The town watched her haul the posts and wire in a borrowed cart, and their pity deepened into a kind of morbid fascination. They were watching a slow public failure, and it was more interesting than any Sunday sermon. The work of the fence was brutal. The soil near the road was thin and studded with stones that fought the post-hole digger with malicious intent. Elspeth's hands, soft from a life lived elsewhere, blistered on the first day, bled on the second,
and by the end of the week were turning into calloused leather. Mr. Johansson came over most afternoons, not to help directly, but to teach. He showed her how to sight a straight line, how to tamp the earth around a post until it was solid as a church pillar, how to stretch the wire with a comb-long tool until it sang with tension. "A good fence is a good neighbor," he'd say, "even if your only neighbor is a goat." He taught her the rhythm of the work, the way to use her body's weight instead of just her arms' strength. He never spoke of her folly, only of the task at hand. His quiet belief in the process was a balm against the town's loud disbelief in the outcome. When she drove the last staple, she stood back, her whole body aching, and looked at the 5 acres she had enclosed. It was a small bite out of the monster, a tiny corral in a vast wilderness of green, but it was hers. It was real. The next week, she bought the goats, 20 of them, from a farmer on the far side of the county who was glad to be rid of the cursed fence-jumping devils. They were a motley crew, lop-eared, Roman-nosed, some with coats like ragged patchwork quilts. They were not beautiful, but their eyes were bright with a defiant, unnerving intelligence. As she herded them down the road to her property, the children of Harmony Creek followed, laughing and pointing. "The goat woman!" they shouted. "Elspeth and her goat-brained army!" She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the shuffling, bleeding herd, her face a mask of calm. She opened the gate she had built, and the goats flowed into the kudzu. For a moment they stood, sniffing the air. Then, as one, they lowered their heads and began to eat. The sound was a steady, rhythmic tearing, a sound of voracious, methodical destruction. It was the most hopeful sound she had ever heard. The goats worked with a single-minded purpose that bordered on holy. They were the right tool for the right trouble. They started with the low-hanging leaves, stripping them from the vines with nimble lips. Then they stood on their hind legs, necks stretched, to reach the higher clusters. When that was not enough, they began to climb, their cloven hooves finding impossible holds in the lattice of vines, their bodies swaying as they devoured their way upward. Elspeth watched, fascinated. They were not just eating, they were dismantling. They ate the leaves, then chewed the tender green shoots, then peeled the bark from the thicker vines, girdling them. Within a week, the area nearest the fence was riddled with shafts of sunlight reaching the ground for the first time in decades. A small boy began to appear at the fence line every day after his chores. His name was Tom, a quiet, watchful child who never seemed to fit in with the other boys in town. He didn't mock or jeer, he just watched the goats, his face rapt with attention. Elspeth, recognizing a fellow outsider, took to leaving a dipper of cool water for him by a fence post. One day, he spoke. "That one," he said, pointing a thin finger. "He's the king." He was pointing at a big, grizzled buck with one broken horn and an air of profound dignity. "He always eats first." Elspeth nodded. "I call him General." Tom smiled, a rare and brilliant thing. "I like that." Soon he was helping. He carried buckets of water, learned to spot a loose staple in the fence, and helped her herd the goats to a new section when they had cleared the first. He had a gift with them, a quiet patience they responded to. He gave them all names: Stonewall, Patches, Shadow, Old Man Hemlock. He spoke to them as equals. For Elspeth, his companionship was a quiet comfort, a buffer against the loneliness. For Tom, the goat farm became a place of purpose, a world where his quiet nature was a strength, not a weakness. Together, they watched the green tide recede. Elspeth kept the progress to herself. When she went to town for supplies, she met the knowing smirks and whispered questions with a placid stillness. Let them think she was failing.
Success was a coal you banked low under ash, saving its heat for when the world grew truly cold. At night, she'd lie awake and listen to the sound of the goats tearing and chewing in the dark, and she would do the arithmetic of her new life. 20 goats, 70 acres, one day at a time. It was a slow, steady equation, and it was finally starting to add up. By June, it was no longer possible to hide the change. A great scar of brown and gray had appeared on the green hill, visible from the main road. The town's mockery began to curdle into a grudging curiosity. What was the goat woman doing up there? The answer came one clear morning after a night of heavy rain. The water had washed the dust and debris from the goat's latest conquest, and there, gleaming in the morning sun, was a hard, straight line that did not belong to nature. It was a roof line. Elspeth saw it first, her heart leaping into her throat. She and Tom scrambled up the incline, slipping on the muddy earth, their hands grabbing at the naked vines for purchase. It was real. A long, sloping roof of dark gray slate, miraculously intact. The goats had eaten a house out of the jungle. "It's Abernathy's place," Tom whispered, his voice full of awe. "The one they said was gone." They spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of work, encouraging the goats toward the structure with handfuls of feed, pulling at the thickest vines themselves. By evening, they had revealed the top of a stone chimney and the upper frame of a window. The house was not a ruin, it was a fossil, perfectly preserved in its green amber. The discovery changed everything for Elspeth. This was not just land she was reclaiming, it was a home, her own home. The knowledge settled deep in her bones, a quiet, fierce joy. She had not bought a grave, she had bought a sleeping house, and her strange, ragged army was waking it up. The news rippled through Harmony Creek, carried on waves of gossip and disbelief. Silas Croft drove his buggy out to see for himself. He stood on the road, staring up at the emerging roofline, his face unreadable. He had sold her a worthless problem, and she was somehow turning it into a solution. He did not like puzzles he couldn't solve, especially when they involved people he had already dismissed. The arithmetic was changing, and he could feel it. "A thing's only worth what others will pay," the saying went, and the value of Lot 78 was beginning to climb. Over the next month, the house emerged from its cocoon of vines as if being born. The goats, now numbering 37 with the arrival of spring kids, worked tirelessly, their appetites honed by generations of survival. They cleared the walls, revealing sturdy stone on the first floor and weathered clapboard on the second. They uncovered a wide, welcoming porch, its railings miraculously intact. Elspeth and Tom pried the vines away from the front door, and with a groan of rusted hinges, pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the dust of 30 years, but it was dry. The roof had held. Sunlight, filtered through the grimy window panes, illuminated floating dust motes and the ghostly shapes of furniture left behind. A table, 2 chairs, a cold, dark fireplace. It was a shell, but it was a strong shell. It was a home waiting to be filled. As the house was being reborn, so was the herd. The does were heavy with milk, rich and tangy from their diet of kudzu and wild herbs. Elspeth, remembering a skill from her grandmother, began to make cheese, simple, fresh chèvre at first, pressed in muslin bags and salted. It was delicious, with a clean, earthy flavor that tasted of the wild land itself. One sweltering afternoon, a fancy merchant's wagon threw a wheel just down the road from her gate. The driver, a precise-looking man from the city named Mr. Dubois, was in a foul mood until Elspeth offered him a drink of cool water and a slice of her cheese on a cracker. He took it skeptically, this rustic offering from a woman in a dirt-smudged dress. He nibbled. His eyes widened. He took a larger bite, chewing slowly, his expression transforming from irritation to intense concentration. "Madame," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "What is this?" "Goat cheese," she said simply. "No, no," he insisted. "This is not just cheese. This is the land. It has terroir. It tastes of the sun and the stone and this green devil vine. It is remarkable." He was a purveyor of fine foods, supplying the best hotels and restaurants in the capital. Before his wheel was even fixed, he had written Elspeth a contract, offering to buy every wheel of cheese she could produce, at a price that made her hands tremble. She now had a home, a herd, and an income. She had faced the mockery and the doubt and the sheer, overwhelming greenness, and she had won. Or so she thought. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, cloudless blue that offered no promise of relief. The creek that gave the town its name shrank to a muddy trickle. The lush pastures of the valley, the pride of Harmony Creek's cattlemen, turned a uniform and disheartening brown. The grass grew brittle, then vanished, leaving behind cracked, dusty earth. The corn in the fields yellowed and withered on the stalk. A deep anxiety settled over the town. Men gathered at the general store, their faces grim, their talk all of water and feed, and the ruinous price of hay shipped in from the east. The drought was a slow, merciless disaster, grinding away at the prosperity and good humor of the community. But on Elspeth's 70 acres, a strange miracle was at work. The kudzu, that hated invader, had roots that ran deep, tapping into moisture far below the surface where the shallow-rooted pasture grasses could not reach. While the rest of the valley burned, her land remained stubbornly, defiantly green. The goats, far from suffering, were thriving. They had an endless buffet. The leaves were a bit tougher, the taste more concentrated, but it was food. It was life. Elspeth watched the valley turn to dust from her porch, a deep unease settling in her heart. Her own good fortune felt like a betrayal of her neighbors. She saw their wagons pass on the road, their prize cattle looking thin and miserable, their horses kicking up clouds of choking dust. The same people who had mocked her, who had called her the goat-brained fool, were now facing ruin. And she, the fool, had water in her well, and a herd that was fat and happy. Mr. Johansson stopped by one evening, his own fields looking as tired as he did. He accepted a glass of water and looked out at the green expanse. "Funny thing," he murmured, "how the thing everyone curses is the only thing that endures. God has a sense of humor, I think. A hard one." He looked at the sky, his old eyes reading the signs. "This isn't breaking any time soon, little miss. It's going to get worse before it gets better." Hunger changes a town. Desperation changes a man. And Elspeth could feel the change coming. A hot, dry wind blowing from the direction of Harmony Creek. Silas Croft saw the drought not as a tragedy for the community, but as a singular opportunity for himself. He had been watching Elspeth's progress with a tightening knot of envy and disbelief. The worthless land he had offloaded for a pittance was becoming the most valuable parcel in the county, and it was owned by a lone woman he had personally dismissed as a fool. It was an intolerable affront to his sense of order. The drought gave him the leverage he needed. He rode out to her farm one afternoon, his horse looking sleek and well-fed in stark contrast to the struggling livestock in the valley. He found Elspeth whitewashing the porch railings of her reclaimed house. She looked different now. The sorrow in her eyes had been replaced by a steady competence. Her hands were rough, but her gaze was direct. She was no longer a victim. Croft dismounted, all smooth concern and neighborly warmth. "Miss Mayhew," he began, his voice like oil on water. "A terrible time for the valley, just terrible. I've been worried about you, out here all alone." She met his gaze and said nothing, simply waiting. Her stillness unnerved him. "A young woman alone," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the fields, "could never hope to manage through a crisis like this. It takes resources, connections. I'm prepared to help you. I'll take this trouble off your hands. I'll give you a fair price for the land, more than you paid, of course, and you can take that money and go somewhere. Easier." It was not an offer. It was a threat wrapped in the language of chivalry. He was leaning on her perceived weakness, the very thing he had misjudged from the beginning. "I'm not selling, Mr. Croft," she said. Her voice was level, without anger or fear. It was a simple statement of fact. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Be reasonable, child. You're overstocked. Your animals are destroying the land. There are county ordinances about carrying capacity, especially in a drought. It would be a shame if the assessor had to get involved. A real shame." He had revealed his weapon. He would use the law, twist it to his purpose, to take what he could not buy. He thought her isolated, an easy target. He mounted his horse. "Think on it," he said, and rode away, confident that fear would do the work his money could not. Elspeth watched him go, then turned back to her whitewashing. She was alone, yes, but she was no longer lonely. And she was not afraid. The first to come was Mr. Henderson, a proud, stoic farmer whose herd of prize-winning dairy cows was now down to a half-dozen bony creatures with dull eyes. He stood at her gate, his hat crushed in his hands, his pride warring with the desperation on his face. He had been one of the loudest mockers, a man who had declared publicly that Elspeth Mayhew was crazier than a Bessie bug in a bottle. Now he could not meet her eyes. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, I was wondering, that green stuff, my cows, they'll eat anything now. I'd pay for some grazing." This was the moment, the moral choice. She held all the power. She could have named a ruinous price. She could have savored her victory and turned him away, repaying his scorn with her own. The whole town was watching, waiting to see what the fool would do now that she held the winning hand. She looked at his cracked hands, the deep worry lines around his eyes, and saw not an enemy, but a neighbor in trouble. "The price," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is 1 bucket of milk per cow per week, for as long as the drought lasts. And you help me and Tom move the fence line every 3rd day." Henderson looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was not just a fair price, it was a generous one. It was an offer of partnership, not exploitation. He nodded, unable to speak, a look of profound, humbled gratitude on his face. Word of her offer spread through the valley faster than a brush fire. By evening, a line of farmers was at her gate. She made the same deal with each of them. Her land, the scorned Kudzu heap, became the valley's salvation. The arithmetic had inverted completely. Her generosity was binding the community to her, creating a debt not of money, but of goodwill. It was this that Silas Croft had fatally misunderstood. He arrived 2 days later, an official-looking document in his hand and a smug look on his face. "Miss Mayhew," he announced loudly, for the benefit of the gathered farmers. "As I warned you, this is a seizure order. You are in violation of County Ordinance 114, overstocking of pasturage during a declared drought. Your animals are forfeit." He expected her to crumble. He expected the other farmers to melt away, unwilling to get involved. He was wrong. Mr. Henderson stepped forward. "That's not right," he said, his voice ringing with new authority. "Her animals ain't overstocked. Most of these animals are mine. And his. He pointed to another farmer who nodded grimly. And his. One by one, they stepped up. They were not grazing on her land. They were partners in a managed herd. They were witnesses. Croft's face went pale. His legal weapon was useless against a united community. He had counted on her being one person, alone. It was not. She was the center of a town pulling itself back from the brink, and they would not let him touch her. Shamed and outwitted, he crumpled the paper in his fist and rode away, the dust from his horse's hooves tasting of bitter defeat. The rains came in the first week of September. Not a deluge, but a soft, soaking drizzle that smelled of damp earth and life renewed. It rained for 3 days, gently, insistently, as if trying to apologize for the sky's long cruelty. The valley drank it in, and within a week, a faint, hopeful fuzz of green had begun to appear on the brown pastures. The crisis was over, but the town of Harmony Creek was not the same. The mockery was gone, replaced by a deep and quiet respect. When Elspeth rode to town now, heads nodded. Miss Mayhew. People met her eyes. They saw not the fool, but the woman who had saved them. They saw the quiet strength they had mistaken for weakness, the patience they had mistaken for madness. Tom was no longer the shy, overlooked boy. He was Elspeth's right-hand man, directing the rotation of the herds with a quiet confidence that made the older farmers listen. He had found his place. The house was now a home. Elspeth had whitewashed the walls, replaced the broken panes of glass, and planted a small kitchen garden near the porch. The money from Mr. Dubois' cheese contract provided a steady, comfortable income. Her chev, aged now in the cool stone cellar, was becoming famous in the city, a delicacy born of a scorned vine and a woman's stubborn will. One cool evening, as the sun set, painting the freshly washed sky in shades of rose and gold, Elspeth sat on her porch swing, watching her goats graze peacefully on a hillside that was now a patchwork of managed pasture and woodland. The house stood solid and serene behind her, a testament to what can be found beneath the surface of things. Mr. Johansson walked over, as he often did, and sat beside her. He looked out at the thriving farm, at the healthy animals, at the smoke curling from the chimney of the house everyone had forgotten. He looked at Elspeth, at the peace that had settled on her face, a peace earned through hard labor and a harder choice. He nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips beneath his great white beard. "You see," he said, his voice a gentle rumble of contentment. "The right tool for the right trouble." He took a deep breath of the clean, cool air. "And patience. God is never late." Elspeth smiled, a true and easy smile, and watched as the last of the light faded, leaving her safe and secure in the heart of the home she had eaten out of the wilderness.